Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we're starting our second attempt at making our own version of Plants vs. Zombies. Indeed, with GameMaker 2.3 finally out, it's time for us to take what we learned from our first attempt and do better with the second. But instead of trying to remake the game like last time, this time we'll be attempting to demake the game. And we'll be doing it in the aesthetic of the good old toy from the 90s, the Tiger Electronics handhelds. These relics of the past were single-screen handhelds with some simplistic graphics and gameplay, and I feel like Plants vs. Zombies could be made in a similar style. So the plan for this project will be to create a demake of Plants vs. Zombies with features and visuals inspired by the classic Tiger Electronics games from the 90s. And to make things even more interesting, we'll attempt to do this in as few objects as possible, maybe only one if we're savvy enough. And today we'll begin that journey by focusing on creating the base for our gameplay, including plant placement and a basic attack system. Sounds like a plan, so let's not waste any more time and get to the coding. First up was creating our game board, which of course will be broken down into a grid of 16 by 16 cells, and with each cell holding the data for plants placed in them. Next, you'll notice nothing's happening. And that's because it was at this moment I decided to abandon the safe plan I had going into this project to do something crazy. We were going to forego using the nested arrays to keep track of our data and instead use something new to GameMaker 2.3, and that's structs. So I created a plant spawn constructor. The data within the struct would be for plant type, name, and health. Then came the even crazier part. I made that constructor into an inherited constructor, which meant a new struct would be created based on the plant spawn constructor, but in this case would contain the data specifically for the Peashooter. Now, before we could test if any of this would even work, we needed a sprite. And so I drew a crude Peashooter Sprite, which oddly looked pretty on par with the Tiger Electronics graphics from back in the day. Anyway, with the sprites now done and our structs now ready to be constructed, it was time to make the magic happen. To make things easier, I moved the constructor code to a script to make the function global and added enums to keep things as focused as possible. I then added a few arguments to the Peashooter struct that we'll need for spawning purposes. Back in the controller object, I drew a temporary grid and set up a few variables to keep track of the mouse's position within said grid. And as you can see, this will allow us to keep our bearings when trying to place plants into the world, because much like the Tiger Electronics games, the background is a muddy, simplified version of Plants vs. Zombies backyard scene. With the scene ready to go, I used our constructor to spawn a Peashooter when the left mouse button is pressed. And to avoid boundary errors, I restricted the check to only within the grid space. Then for testing purposes, I had the right click delete the plant data and reset the targeted cell. And finally, in the draw event, any cell with Peashooter data would display the Peashooter Sprite. And testing showed that despite the risk of uncertainty, the code ended up working. When clicking within the space of the grid, Peashooter sprites would pop up, which meant that our new structs were being added to the cells. And right-clicking would clear the cell, thus removing the Peashooter sprite from the board. This was promising because despite a few concerns, this meant we no longer had to rely on actual objects to maintain plant data. So next up, it was time to start working on the attack system. First, we were going to need a projectile for the Peashooter to, well, shoot. And next, it was back to the global script. Much like the plants, projectiles would also exist via struct data, which we'd keep track of via DSList. Then in the controller object, I created a tick function. This would work similarly to our Minecraft 2D demake, where actions would occur on a per tick basis. It's gonna be the literal life pulse of our game. And to start, we simply have any existing Peashooters fire a projectile on every tick, which for now is every 30 frames. Then for any existing projectiles, they would move one cell to the right per tick. And finally, this data was used to create the visual effect of projectiles moving across the screen. And due to the nature of the movement being cell-based, it was kinda hard to tell, but trust me, the code was in fact working. And so back in the code, once the projectile exists beyond the game space, the entry is deleted from the list. And just to add some temporary variety, I added a chance to the Peashooters firing a projectile. This was honestly a very surprising start to the project. Going with structs was a very spontaneous decision, one I don't do very often. So it was nice that despite my limited knowledge, I was still able to pull off the idea with any sort of succession. I do have my concerns with continuing to use structs though. What I'm learning about structs is that they're better used for less dynamic data. And as far as I understand, especially when it comes to inherited structs, there's a lot of restrictions. And on top of that, I have no idea how GameMaker handles cleanup of those structs. For example, is simply removing the data from cells enough, especially when GameMaker suggests deleting structs after use like their data structures? Truth be told, I was surprised to see the FPS data based on this system. I'm not sure if 2.3 is to blame, maybe it's my computer, or that struct data isn't being cleaned out, but I'm almost tempted to revert to nested arrays and see if I can get the same results with better performance. Which is really the beauty of Let's Dev. We'll experiment to see what works best and hope for the best while we're at it. And we'll continue to do just that next time, because that brings us to the end of today's episode of Let's Dev. So leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on our start to our second attempt in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.